Tammy's expertise in family psychology has allowed her to positively impact thousands and fostered incredible self-fulfillment in every client she assists. Welcome.
Thank you. Is this my clicker? All right, technology and I get along sometimes, we'll see. So, my clinical specialty is treating childhood trauma and treating childhood anxiety. And I still work as a clinician, and I am the executive director of a counseling agency, but what I'm doing now is mostly this kind of thing. I found that my role was better served telling people stories and helping people connect in a bigger level, to be hands for children to facilitate healing. And part of my role is to teach the story of the brain, to share the stories of the children I've worked with, of the clinicians I've worked with, the clinicians I train, and hope that we can start to facilitate change. And it's interesting because she was talking about the power of story and narratives. And I'm going to be touching on that, and the power of the empathic response, and what that's like to sit with someone in their trauma, and to sit with someone who has been in so much pain and is in so much shame. And shame came up in the last presenter. And I was like, okay, well, at least hard to follow that up, but I'm going to try really, really hard here. So I'm a fur mom, and I'm a mom, and I'm a clinician. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I came from a background of trauma myself. Go figure, someone from trauma then teaches about trauma, right? So my story, I'm not going to get into too much, but I came from a house full of addiction, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and then parental alienation with high conflict divorce. So when we talk about ACEs, and I've seen that's been talked about at some point today, yes, ACEs? Or am I really just starting to talk? I might delve into this a little bit. But we talk about adverse childhood experiences. And if we look in this room, there's just over probably 100 people, 120 people in this room. So at least 80 of you have had an adverse childhood experience. And about 20 of you have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So all of you have this story that's probably, at some point, gut-wrenching, bring you to your knees kinds of stories, if we really sat together and shared, and were wholehearted with each other. So this isn't us versus them conversation we're about to have. This is an all of us conversation we're going to have about trauma. Because I guarantee, with what you guys have been talking about in this conference, this is all about trauma. It's about addiction. It's about not knowing where your next meal's coming from, being homeless. It's through sitting with someone in their shit. To be able to hold that for someone. And this is why, when they ask to speak, that I'm going to talk about brain science, but ultimately, this is about connection. We talk about the brain and trauma. There is always a cure to every mental illness. We may struggle, but there is cure. There is healing. We're going to go into that here. I want to show, I don't know if you can see this, I always show this video when I talk about trauma, because every time I try to get a storyline about a client, I end up just like weeping in front of everyone. So I'm going to skip that part, not be that vulnerable, and I'm just going to show this, and then I can address this little girl as we go through the presentation. I have seen that video 100 times, and I still tear up every time I see it. And it doesn't matter how many videos I could show you of people talking about trauma. Until you get to walk a child's path and story, especially to connect the research and the literature and the treatment outcomes, I can't do it justice. So I always show this, and I know I just ate up 10 minutes of my speaking time showing this video, but I think it's really important. Because at the end of that video, we saw light, and there's always light. And when I teach a whole course on trauma. At the very end, I really try to highlight that there's a way through this. There's always a way through it, and it's always through connection and through attachment. But first we have to at least understand and have a basis of knowing how this narrative forms in the brain and how this interferes with our way to connect with other people, and how people misread these kids. They don't see them for who they are because they have all these defenses. The brain has put up these walls to keep them safe. And these defenses have been there for a very, very good reason. I'm here to talk to you about that. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm the normal, ordinary human adaptations to life. And so these are your ACEs. Somewhere in this room, someone has been impacted. We think of adverse childhood experiences as being physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, domestic violence, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance abuse, criminal behavior, incarceration, separation, or divorce. Like I said before, 70% of you have experienced one of these. And 13% of you have experienced 4 or more of these, just in this room alone. So what we know is based on this research done in the 90s, the Center for Disease Control, Kaiser Permanente, is that adverse trauma, and this is adverse childhood experience, blah, 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 trauma doesn't just impact your mental well-being. It impacts your DNA. It impacts your immune system. It impacts how long you're going to live. The chances of you developing cancer, heart disease, lung disease, asthma, COPD. It's a health issue. It's not a mental health issue. This is a health issue. This is an epidemic. And when we look at something that's changing kids' physiology, you see, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, how many kids are diagnosed with ADHD? Bullshit. That's trauma. Not to say ADHD doesn't exist, but not the way it is diagnosed. We're looking at trauma. We're looking at adverse childhood experiences. Oh, let me go back here for a second. Look at this. If you have, so the 13% of you in this room who have 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experience, have a 1,500% increased risk of suicide. 1,500%. 4.5 more times likely to develop depression. You have 7 ACEs, you are going to statistically die 20 years earlier than your counterpart. This is not a mental health issue, this is a health issue. This is a health epidemic. It, of course, affects our mental health, but it affects our healthcare system, our schools, our neighborhoods, our cultures, our communities. We need to start paying attention to this. So we know at the core, sorry, I'm just getting used to this clicker here. At the core, trauma is overwhelming, unbelievable, and unbearable. So the problem is what is traumatic to one child isn't necessarily traumatic to another child. Because we talked earlier, someone mentioned resilience. How many adverse child experiences have they had? What kind of supports do these kids have? What kind of attachments do they have? And so it's also not exactly what happens to you, so much as what is the result of these experiences. It changes what's inside of you. It changes your neurology. It changes your quality of relationships. It changes the health of your body. It can change your DNA. How big is that? So at the end of the day, what we have are kids who are disconnected from themselves and from being able to relate to other human beings. Because they don't feel safe. They don't feel lovable. They feel shame. And if you guys are familiar with shame, shame is feeling defective, that you are no good. Not I made a mistake. I got a bad grade on a test. I went the wrong way home. I was late coming home. It is I am unlovable. And at the core of being unlovable is a lack of being able to survive, to be cared for, and essentially in the brain can be equated with death. Shame, at the core of us, is a traumatic emotion for many of us, to feel unlovable, to feel unwanted. And that's what trauma, to me, essentially is a wave of shame that goes over us. I was undeserving of love, connection, and protection. Key there, protection. I was not protected, I wasn't cared for. And this is not meant to be a shaming thing for parents who have not been able to provide for their kids, but we're talking about a child's experience of care, of protection, of love, of attention so the brain can grow. So I mean, trauma, you know very well being at this, what trauma is. It can be many different things, and it can mean what is to one person is not to another. But understanding of the brain and what happens, I think this is key in just teaching our colleagues and other professionals and parents about the brain is at the core of what our institute does. And any mental health issue is understanding, and especially how trauma impacts our brains and our ability to relate. And what we know about the brain is it forms in 3 sections sequentially. We have the brain stem, the limbic, and then the cortical brain. And what I want you to know about the brain stem is that's what you're born with. That's your DNA determines. It's you breathing and your pupils dilating, your blood pressure, all of these things. It's your central nervous system. And then what forms after is your limbic system, which I really think is your ability to remember, to relate, to connect with other human beings, your emotional experience. And that limbic system and that brain stem work together to form attachment and emotions and for self-preservation. If all goes well, and I say if all goes well, we have the luxury, oh my Okay, we have the luxury of developing the cortical brain, which is all about being able to think, to critical thinking, executive functioning. Do I need teachers in this room? Executive functioning, planning ahead, remembering what's a good choice, what's not a good choice. So what we have, again, is that limbic system and that cortical brain should work together. And here we've got survival, it's reactive, we have the senses, it's primitive, and this works together. And if any of you are familiar with the fight, flight, freeze, collapse response, this is where this hangs out, is in these two areas. But guess what? We have also these higher functioning parts of our brain that should come online at about 5 to 7 years of age if the lower parts of the brain have developed. If they have been given nurturance and connection and attachment, then the brain says, okay, we don't need to be in that survival part of our brain. We can actually develop the cortical part of our brain, which is about emotion regulation, understanding behavior, understanding what comes next. Is that a good idea to hit my friend? Is that a good idea to swear at my teacher? Is that a good idea to shoplift that item? Okay, that's executive function, that's your prefrontal cortex. Traumatic children don't have the luxury of developing this, because guess what their brains are so busy doing? Surviving. Of the brain are so specialized in survival that the rest of the brain says, we've got better things to do than to teach you how to rationally think, to do math, to learn to read, to have developed critical thinking skills. No, you need to stay alive right now. So what happens is this amygdala and the limbic center of the brain is essentially the watchdog of the brain. It's a part of the brain that is surveying the scene to say, am I safe? Am I connected? Can someone keep me alive? It's a little bit paranoid because it's got to keep you safe. And if you aren't safe, it's going to activate every alarm in your brain to say, how do I preserve my life right now? Again, why would the upstairs brain develop, the logical brain develop, if this dog, and this is how I talk to kids, I'm a play therapist, I say, that dog in your brain is like a chihuahua. It just doesn't stop yapping. And I always tell kids, because I'm always about strength-based approaches, like, wow, that part of your brain works so much better than a lot of kids' brains. It's so specialized. It's even a little bit bigger than the other parts of your brain. It's going to keep you so safe in your life. That's so amazing. But that part of your brain needs to take a nap for a little bit, buddy. Like, it is exhausted from barking so loud all day long. So this is what happens. Now, how many of you are familiar with Daniel Siegel's brain and hand model? A couple, okay. Mental health professionals in the room. Okay. I'm going to get you to engage. Everybody put your hand up. Everybody put your hand up. Your forearm here. This is your spinal cord. Okay? Point this, your palm. This is your brain, your central nervous system. Okay? Now put your thumb in the middle. That's your emotional brain. That is your memories, your explicit memories, remembering something happening to you. Okay? Now put your fingers over top. That's your thinking brain. It's your executive functioning. It's a part of your brain that comes online after the lower brain has developed. And when trauma happens, when you go into fight, flight, freeze, collapse response, guess what happens to your thinking brain if it's even developed? Phew, goes offline. There is a lack of electrical conductivity between the lower brain and the upper brain. And what happens is we go into fight, flight, freeze, collapse. This is a survival mechanism, and our brain, first and foremost, we are thinking creatures, we are connecting creatures. Our brain, the first thing it does is tries to keep us alive. That's its number one duty, is to keep us alive. And so, think about a lioness hunting a gazelle, and it's on the savannah, but it's eating its grass, and it hears something or smells something. What's the first thing it does? Freeze. Pops its head up, right? Now it sees the lion, what happens? It gets the hell out of there. He doesn't want to get eaten. It's going to run out of there. Now the lioness, I say lioness because it's usually the females doing the hunting. The lioness captures the gazelle. What does it now do? Does it just say, okay, eat me? No. It fights. It's going to fight. It's going to struggle to get away. Now the last piece that often people miss, now you go Google Nat Geo Wild gazelle being eaten by lion, is what happens. What happens to the gazelle in that last moment before it dies? Before it dies. That's a really great word. Surrender. I'm going to use that. It surrenders. It collapses. Any medical professionals here? Okay, good. That's great. Because now I don't have to be so on the spot when talking about shock. But When you go into collapse, does anyone know that the service of collapse, to go into shock, what that would mean? Why would we have shock? If any of you have been in an accident or had a big wound, been injured, how many of you have experienced it didn't hurt? Your adrenaline's pumping, it doesn't hurt. It's so you don't feel getting eaten. That's why if we think about it like being attacked by a predator, it's so your brain says, adios, I'm out of here. I do not need you to feel this. So survivors of domestic violence or sexual abuse will often report not remembering something happening, floating outside their body like they were watching it happening, or this I just didn't feel anything, or they focus on something else and they just check out. That's your freeze and collapse response that's happening in the brain. So think about you going hiking in the mountains and there's a bear. What's going to happen is when you see that bear, your pituitary gland is going to send a message to, pituitary, it's going to send a message to your adrenal glands. You're going to pump out something called cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart's going to race, your pupils are going to dilate so you can see where you have to run or where you have to fight. The blood's going to run to your extremities. Your heart's going to go fast. You may end up peeing yourself because your bladder's like, you don't need this extra urine here, man. Like, you need to run away. We can't hold anything here right now. Like, I got to get out of here. Okay? And this is going to help you either fight off the bear, get away, or if you can access that prefrontal cortex, you think like Boy Scouts or Girl Guides being like, if you get attacked by a bear, you got to play dead. Okay, if you have that luxury to remember this fact, you will play dead. It's all about survival. But what happens when there's no bear? That's a problem, is our brains, after trauma, have these threatening things happen to us. And it's like coming home to a bear every night, even when there's no bear. Our lower brain areas are primed to release cortisol and adrenaline. We flip our lid. We're in a state of survival. And if we're in a state of survival, we can't think, we can't connect, we can't make good decisions. This is just, I'm not going to get into this. This is just, I already kind of mentioned what trauma does in the body. But understand that neurons fire together, wire together. And if you have trauma after trauma after trauma, your brain is going to wire for survival, not for rational thinking, not for emotion regulation. And what we're going to see, and I'll see if I have that brain scan here for you. I'm going to go ahead. Here we go. Look at the brain impacted by trauma. Guess what? Those lower brainstem areas are working very, very, very well. That child can protect themselves like that. But they cannot learn well. It's difficult for them to learn. It's difficult for them to remember things, to pay attention, to sit for 8 hours in a desk at school. Good freaking luck. I was a teacher before I was a psychologist. Kids with trauma have a very difficult time saying so, or they're called inattentive, ADHD. They can't pay attention. They're always zoning out. They're zoning out because their brain's trying to keep them in collapse response. They're just trying to stay alive. Of course they can't pay attention. They have flipped their lid. They're checked out. They think the brain thinks there's a bear in the room. Okay? There's no bear, but the brain sure thinks there's a bear in the room. Okay. So again, we've got this downstairs brain specialized in reacting to fear for survival. And then we have brain damage that happens. I want to say that the cool thing, because I love the brain, as you can tell, I have a little crush on this, and understanding the brain and understanding effective treatment, is that we can change this. The brain is so interesting that we can change from the time we're born until we die through something called neuroplasticity. Because we can wire the brain for connection. We can wire the brain for safety. But guess what? I always think of it as like a path that we have to walk. Now think of going hiking, and there's a path. How do we get a path in the woods? Does a path just radically appear, and we're like, oh, we're going to take a hiking path? How did that happen? How is there a path in the woods? How does our hiking trail come to be? You have to walk that path, what? Over and over and over. These kids have walked, and the adults that you work with have walked a path of fear and survival for so long. We have to teach the brain to connect the neurons in a different way and to take a new path. But do you think the kids have to walk this path once for a new path to form? Oh my God, we have to walk these kids and these adults through this new path of connection and to teach the brain that there's no bear thousands and thousands of times. And eventually the brain changes. We can see scans of doing trauma work with kids and adults, and the brain rewires for connection, for calmness, for emotion regulation. And that is the good news, is we can change this. Had this person had a lot of trauma treatment, connection, really good attachments, we would see changes in these deficits. The other thing to understand about these kids you're working with and adults and teens, their brain has formed differently than the average brain. We have a left and right hemisphere. How many people in this room are super logical, linear, organized people? Like, you got the list out. Like, and if something big happens, you're like, no, we have to do this and this and this, and you're planners, and you were probably here 20 minutes early with your agenda, everything laid out, okay? How many of you are those kind of people? Just tell me. How many of you are very right-brained people? Very emotional, empathic, intuitive, creative, like that's more you? Okay, some more right-brained people here than left. Some people are bouncing between the two. It rarely happens, okay? But guess what? Children are more in their right brains. Kids are very emotional in their bodies. It's how their brains are specialized. When there's trauma, the right brain is damaged. And which means is there's often no connection that goes back and forth between the right and left hemispheres. The left brain is about logic and language. Lots of kids with trauma have no language for it. What they've experienced is mostly in the body, mostly in their emotional center, but during times of flipping their lid, the two halves of the brain can't talk to one another. My job as a therapist is literally getting these two parts of the brain to talk to each other. That's my job as a trauma therapist, is for the right and the left to have a conversation. But to do that, you have to be able to feel your feelings, to be connected, to feel safe, and then to someone to help. You have to tell your story. You have to be able to tell your story. You have to be able to hone into those emotions, how that felt in your body, the thoughts that come with that, and be able to teach the brain it was in the past. You are not living with that bear in the moment, and you're safe in this moment while you're sitting with me. So anyway, this is just another diagram to look at that, the two halves of the brain. So what happens is when there's kids and adults from trauma flip their lid, they either are flooded with emotions and they react, they're fight, flight, they freak out, or they become hyper rigid in their thinking. Okay, really rigid. No, it's this way and have to do it this way, and if you don't listen to them, then they'll flip their lid. But sometimes they talk at it. I see this more with men, where they will talk at their trauma, not say, oh, I felt really scared when that happened. That was really overwhelming for me. Okay, there's a disconnect. They can't feel and talk about it at the same time. Okay, so in order for the left and the right to talk about this, it requires that prefrontal cortex to kind of be the navigator to do this. So a lot of this, what we're doing with being able, and I'm going to talk about treatment in a second, is to sit with someone through their freaking story. Do you know how much that heals people, to sit with someone in their story without judgment? To sit with them in their pain? And in that moment, connect with their right brain, because that's what trauma work is connecting that right brain and saying, that was so hard for you, that must have been so frightening. Or you must have been so angry when your dad did that, as they tell their story. That is, if we could take a brain scan, I wish I had one to show you how that lights up the brain and creates healing. It's amazing, that connection between that right and left hemisphere. And this is my ADHD controversy. Any of you work with kids who are quote ADHD? Okay, again, I mean, my business partner specializes in ADHD. I know it exists, but I don't think it exists the way we diagnose it. Okay? Hyperactivity, distractibility, can't read social cues, forgetful, decreased awareness of consequence, disorganization. Those are all trauma symptoms. All trauma symptoms. Yet, they are also considered ADHD symptoms. So I once watched a TED Talks, and the clinician, the medical doctor said, if she was treating patients, and she had 100 patients, and they were all drinking from the same well, and 98% of them developed diarrhea and stomach pains, you could give dose after dose after dose of medication and hope something changes, or you could say, what the hell's in this water? Why are all these kids from these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, having all these symptoms? We know it's trauma. We know it's adrenaline and cortisol and lack of connection that's causing these symptoms. They're in survival mode. But what we end up doing is we can't differentiate between ADHD and all kinds of oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, I could go on. Most of what I see is trauma in my clinical practice. Most of what I see is trauma. Whether they're small t traumas or big T traumas, most mental health illness is due to trauma. So throw most of the DSM out the window, and I'm like, okay, so most of what I look at in clinical practice, personality disorders, high conflict divorce, separation anxiety, is mild form of trauma. Okay, Not always big key traumas, but small traumas. We have an answer. You know what? I think as a psychologist, we go through all this frickin' school and these crazy exams, and we jump through every frickin' hoop. And what I'm learning at the end of the day is you don't need a damn degree to do this work. You don't need letters behind your name. You don't. Some of the biggest helpers I've ever met have absolutely no education. You know, this allows me to pay the bills, but you know what? A degree doesn't give you the ability to have empathy. It does not give you the capacity to stay present with someone in their pain. Okay? So what we really think, and thank God therapy is going this direction now, is that it turns out the source of most of healing is bloody relationships, is attachment. And it's our survival instincts are attachment. And we find it in all mammals across all species, is that a child is born very vulnerable, and in order for a child to survive, they need an adult to take care of them. And that parent has to give a shit about them to take care of them. There has to be love there. So the brain even has all these chemicals like oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin and adrenaline. All these things are released for connection, so we love our babies. All right? But things can get in the way of that. Trauma, a parent's trauma can get in the way of that. Postpartum depression, homelessness can get in the way of that. But at the end of the day, if we are not connected and attached to our caregivers, and I don't just say parents, I say our caregivers, it is the equivalent to our lower brain areas of death. Death is looming. It's the bear. So when children feel unloved, unprotected, and unwanted, the brain is screaming at them, you are about to die. Do whatever you can to protect yourself. This is not unique to kids. We, as adults, experience this. If you've ever lost a loved one, had a breakup, had a dissolution of a marriage, lost a parent, you feel like a piece of you has died. Because attachment, losing attachment is like death to the brain. Our survival is on the line. This is our protective factor against trauma, against ACEs, is attachment. And this attachment can be anybody. It doesn't have to be a parent. It can be a grandparent, a caseworker, a teacher, daycare worker, therapist. It can be anybody. Thank you. And this is the mechanism of connection. Is these things called mirror neurons. It's so cool. Again, I have such a crush on brain science because I can qualify that having a relationship with someone literally changes the brain, and this is exactly how it works. I'm so left-brained that way that I need to be able to qualify and quantify what I'm doing up here. But when you sit with a child or a client, and you see the tear and hurt on their face, and you say to that person, that was so hard for you. I know what that's like. I've been scared in my life too. I have felt rejection. I have felt like maybe I wasn't taken care of. And in that moment, you connect with that client on a visceral level. You feel the connection. You're attuned. There's something firing in both your brains called mirror neurons. You've connected. What's really cool is you've connected the your right hemisphere, their right hemisphere. And this is the source of resiliency and empathy and attachment. Is these mirror neurons. And what mirror neurons really do is they say, when you hurt, I hurt. When you take a glass of water, I feel thirsty. If I'm a sports fan and I'm watching the Calgary Flames and it's the playoffs, when a ref makes a shitty call, I'm going to get really, really mad about that because my mirror neurons are firing. And so when we need to connect with our clients, with these kids, with these teens, with these adults, we need to be able to feel that hurt and connect with that hurt in ourselves. What was that like? What's my narrative? Can we sit with that hurt too? And in that is empathy, is to be able to connect and be with someone in their hurt, to see them for who they are, past the behaviors, past the defense that they have put up, and say, I see you. You are lovable, you are wanted, and you are safe. You have to walk with them through their trauma. Which also means, unfortunately, that you have to be okay with their feelings and okay with your feelings around anxiety and trauma. Any good trauma therapist has done trauma work themselves. They have done, I hope, most of them I know have done trauma therapy because they probably had some trauma in their lives. And if this stuff triggers you, and you flip your lid every time you sit with someone in their pain, you can't have empathy. Do you know what that's called? Feeling bad for someone? That's sympathy. And what Brene Brown says is have sympathy is to feel bad for someone. And how does that feel when someone just feels bad for you? You feel like a victim, right? It feels icky. You feel like someone's feeling sorry for you, okay? What if I normally get up on a chair and do this, but I'm kind of on a platform right now. Sympathy is looking down on someone and saying, like, I'm really sorry you went through that. I'm going to stay up here while you're down there, and I'll offer some encouraging words, but I'm not going to be really with you in this. Yeah. Empathy is to get down in the hole, to be with someone in their pain, recognize what that was like for you. Maybe you didn't go through that experience, okay? But you know what it is like to hurt like that, to feel unsafe, unwanted, unloved, anxious, mad, whatever the emotion is. And it is through that, those mirror neuron connections, through empathy, that's where healing happens. I'm not going to have time. I didn't know how long this would take because I tend to go off on tangents when I speak. How much time do I have? Okay, 10 minutes. When we're thinking about, now how many of you are working, I assume you guys are all working with, have worked with kids, teens, kids? Yes, okay. Hands on the top of the circle, hands on the bottom of the circle. If you want to provide space for these kids to do their healing, they need to feel safe with you. You need to teach parents how to do this. Kids and adults, we actually all need this. This does not change. It just looks a little different as we get older. For a child to feel safe, they need to be able to explore their environment, take risks. They need to have someone delight in what they're doing. They need a cheerleader as they take risks to try new things. And at the same time, when they get overwhelmed, when things get hard, when they make a mistake and they feel bad, they need to come back. We call this coming back on the circle, where we as the attachment figure say, I've got you. I can see that this is just a behavior you're acting out, but you are still good. I'm here for you. I'm with you. And we help organize the feelings. This is what therapy is. Therapy is a therapist sitting in a room, and when that client starts crying and losing it, we say, I've got you. You're going to be okay. This is really hard work, though. And that is what attachment is about. This is really hard for parents to do when they have trauma. We have to make space for that. You know what? We cannot give to someone we've never received ourselves. It's really hard. This is why I have a hard time with schools teaching empathy. I'm like, that's not actually how the brain works. You have to experience empathy to give empathy. So especially as you work with these parents, one of your biggest things to do is become the hands for the parents you work with. You have to say, I've got you in this. I'm with you in this. You do not have to feel shame about what has happened, because that is now in the past, and we're going to move forward, and we're going to make maybe different choices about this. But I've got you. I can handle your story. I can handle you. And in that, we start to see parents start to make changes. We have to teach parents about attachment, about connection, what happens in the brain. And we, as the professionals, have to help hold their heart so they can hold their child's heart. Parents need to be held too. Okay, it's not just about the kids. The parents, whoever's taking care of these kids need this as well. And I'm not going to get too much into this. But one of the things we see with trauma are limited hands when we have somebody who takes their hands off the circle, which means the parent or the caregiver is mean, weak, or completely gone from that child. This is where children feel completely unsafe, that no one's there to watch them, no one is there to catch them when they fall. And this is where kids turn away, and when they need you the most, they're frightened. This is flipping your lid. This is also called disorganized attachment, reactive attachment disorder. This is when parental alienation happens, and parentification, all these mental health stuff happens, splitting in the personality. If the child who has never been held, they're scared all the time. This is very frightening for kids. We want to create and cultivate secure attachments for kids, because the more bonded children are, the more safe they are, and they can trust themselves and their intuition and believe that they can manage the world. So I'm going to skip because I know we have limited time here. Trauma is invariably involves not being seen, not being mirrored, and not being taken into account. So the evidence-based solution is we are hardwired for connection and no letters are needed. Our deepest fear is disconnection and not belonging. So what we need to do as helpers is to make sure the people we work with feel like they belong with us. They have a home with us, and homes can be temporary. To have someone hold you and to be connected to you, to indicate to them that they are fine just the way they are. They are worthy of belonging in this moment. They do not have to hustle for their worthiness. They are worthy of your care. And it doesn't matter what they do, that doesn't change. They are always worthy. So that's attunement. This is empathy. As I said, I'm going off. I didn't know how long this was going to take. Moving forward, studies on resiliency. It just takes one. We know the research is clear. One secure attachment with an adult. That's it. That's so amazing. Most people who have ACEs are not desolate. Homelessness is not desolation. Sexual abuse is not desolation. Domestic violence is not desolation. They need connection. They need to feel like they belong, they're worthy, and they are not walking the path of shame all the time. That they are good just as they are, despite their narrative, despite the fact where they came from. It is their story. It doesn't need to define them moving forward. They need safe touch, reassurance, consistency, and predictability. It does not mean disaster. Resilience develops best when our kids have secure attachments, support for their emerging autonomy, desire for competence, and guidance through vulnerable territory. That's walking the path. We have to walk the paths with people through attachment. It's being the top and the bottom hand saying, I'm going to support you as you make mistakes, you screw up, and I will be right there with you when you need comfort and connection, and I will see your behavior for what it is, a cry for you feel disconnected, so you're acting, your brain's trying to fight, there's flight, there's freeze, there's collapse, and so of course the behavior looks dysfunctional because the brain's just trying to survive. But if we want to make a difference in the world, the next time you see someone being cruel to another human being, take it personal because it is personal. I lost the last word in there. It's not an us versus them conversation. It's an all of us conversation. We have to teach people about trauma. And this is a hard one, guys. This is the brutal part. You have to take the risk of being vulnerable and being connected. Working with trauma is very vulnerable territory for any human being. To be with someone in that much pain is very uncomfortable for us. We have to be better with empathy versus sympathy, and to feel comfortable with hearing the brutality of their story and finding within us a piece of their story within our own narrative. I hope that makes sense. It takes the whole village to raise a child. And you're the village. What an honor that is to work with clients who have been through this much adversity and to be the hands that hold them in that connection. So you don't know sometimes till years later the difference you've made in a child's life when you can hold their shame and their pain and their story and walk down that path with them and create a new path, a new narrative for them, where they belong, where they are worthy, where they are loved. Okay. Thank you so much.